Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 8th We Were There. This session is about Of Mice and Men, the discovery of the deadly Hantavirus in the Americas in 1993. This series was created so that the original investigators can share their stories and lessons learned, so that others may be inspired to carry on their work. And with no further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Rima Kabaz, who was there as part of the outbreak.
Thanks, Phoebe, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining for this episode of We Were There. Today's topic is extra special for me because this investigation gave me a unique chance to work closely with many outstanding colleagues, including the panelists that we're going to hear from today. The story unfolded in the early 90s when CDC looked a bit different in terms of our building facilities, campus buildings, and operations. It was nevertheless a vibrant place for public health science, especially for infectious diseases here. And one particularly important development at that time was the publication of the Institute of Medicine's landmark report on emerging infectious diseases. The report was a call to action for the United States to launch a meaningful new phase in our fight against infectious diseases. A short time later, CDC published a response that outlined a bold new framework for combating infectious diseases, much of which remains in place today. The outbreak that we're going to be discussing today occurred between the issuance of these two reports, and quite fitting, the cover of that historic CDC report featured an electron micrograph of the newly discovered hantavirus. So a little about the investigation from my perspective. In 1993, I was a medical epidemiologist studying non-HIV human retroviruses, and I loved what I was doing. Like many others, I became concerned as we all heard about reports of a mysterious illness that was sickening people in the Four Corners area of the southwestern United States. It's an area of at the juncture of Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, and includes the homeland of several American Indian tribes. From the outset, the outbreak received intense regional and national attention, and there was widespread misunderstanding and fear among residents of the area. CDC was invited to join and proceeded to work closely on the investigation with state public health agencies, Indian Health Service, and many other partners. CDC's response was managed out of then NCID Director Jim Hughes' office on the 5th floor of Building 1. Remember, we had no emergency operation centers back then. Shortly after I joined the response as a team lead on the Hantavirus task force. As you're going to hear from our panelists, the investigation evolved rapidly along several fronts, most notably epidemiology, laboratory, and ecology. And there's much that can be said about the response, but I just want to mention 5 takeaways that are important to me. One is discovery and innovation. And you'll hear from Dr. Kizek how the combined use of serologic testing and molecular assays led to the rapid identification and characterization of a previously unrecognized hantavirus. Hantavirus had not been reported in the Americas before at that time. Second takeaway is the role of boots-on-the-ground disease detective work in the Four Corners area that identified who was infected and how they were exposed and became ill. The third important one is ecology and the One Health connection. So you're going to hear about the ecologic studies that showed that the primary natural host of this hantavirus was the deer mouse, Peromyscus maniculatus. This investigation, in my mind, serves as a groundbreaking example of what we today call One Health approach that emphasizes the interconnectedness between human health, animal health, and the environment. A fourth takeaway is collaboration with partners. That was key to the success of this investigation, and it is a vital part of all our public health investigations. And a fifth one, last but not least, is cultural awareness and stigmatization. News media coverage of this outbreak, combined with rumors and misinformation, including calling this the Navajo flu, contributed to local misunderstanding about the illness, and many local American Indian residents endured stigmatization and other negative effects of these stories. Public health has since learned to recognize the adverse consequences of stigma during outbreaks such as SARS, H1N1 pandemic, influenza, and Ebola. So in closing my opening remarks, I want to say that this 1993 response remains, in my mind, an illustrative example of how CDC detects, investigates, contains, and prevents outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kabaz. And with that, I'd like to introduce the first boots on the ground speaker we have, Dr. Jay Butler.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And if anybody's streaming from the other side of the Mississippi, good morning. So this is an awesome responsibility and a little bit intimidating, because I'm going to describe my perspectives on an effort that involved hundreds of people and literally dozens of agencies. So disclosure number one is I'm starting out depending on the accuracy of neurons that have lied quiescent for nearly a quarter of a century and have just begun to fire again over the past 10 days. So the story really begins in April and May of 2013, when a number of people developed a severe respiratory illness in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. The illness was characterized by sudden onset of headache, fever, myalgia, and then rapidly progressed to respiratory distress. And patients who were evaluated during that prodromal phase often had a normal chest radiograph, as you see here, but rapidly progressed over 24 to 48 hours to signs and symptoms of acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. The initial cluster that I think really began to get people's attention was when a very popular cross-country runner developed the symptoms and actually collapsed on his way to his fiance's funeral, who had also developed the same syndrome and died very rapidly after hospitalization. There were a number of observations made by astute clinicians, including Bruce Tempest at the Gallup Indian Medical Center, Dr. Patty McFeely, also Indian Health Service providers that were on the Navajo reservation. Alan Craig was at the Shiprock Hospital and actually jumped out of the frying pan into the fire to become the medical director of the Navajo Area Indian Health Service at the time when the outbreak was really being recognized and the investigation was launched. Dr. Deanie Golnick and Tom Hennessy at the Crown Point Medical Center also had been seeing cases. So calls were made to the New Mexico State Health Department, also to Jim Cheek, who was at the Indian Health Service Headquarters West Office and was overseeing a lot of the response around infectious diseases. So on the evening of Thursday, May 27th, the official invitation for CDC to become involved in the investigation, working with the State Health Department and the Indian Health Service, as well as the Navajo Nation Health Department, was issued. So on the morning of Friday, May 28th, for me, it started out as a Friday before a 3-day weekend. I pedaled my bike in from Tucker because the plan was, after the evening traffic had died down, my wife was going to pick me up. We were going to spend the weekend with family in North Carolina. That didn't happen. I was a little late getting in. I remember being stuck at the Fraser Road rail crossing waiting for a slow-moving freight train to get by. So I was kind of hurrying, getting a shower, ran up the back steps of the old Building 1, and going down the 4th floor past the enteric section, the respiratory disease branch, ran into Jay Winger, who said, "Can you come with me up to Jim Hughes's office?" And here's our first difference in memories. Rima, I think that was on the 6th floor, but the building's gone. There's no way to be able to test that. So couldn't resist that. So there was the time with Jay Winger, Jim Hughes, Ruth Berkelman, Rob Bryman, and I got a quick briefing on what was going on. And the thought was we need to get a team into the field. So the decision was made that I would go as, quote, the senior staff person as, I guess, starting my second year at the CDC in Atlanta, along with 2 EIS officers yet to be identified. There were a number of meetings that then occurred that day. Now, here's disclosure number 2. I worry about those quarter-century-old neurons. So I actually have a box of notes and different newspaper clippings and things like that, which you see over here. It's been stored in my barn in Anchorage for the past couple of decades. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'd like to point out that mice have chewed at this. And I think really we're interested in destroying the evidence, But looking at those notes and kind of thinking through that day, it really was back-to-back meetings. And there were recurring concerns about, we don't know what's going on. Let's try to develop a differential diagnosis. An issue that I think we still struggle with in disease outbreaks of unknown etiology is the appropriate triage of clinical specimens and getting them to where they need to be for a broad range of diagnostic tests. There was the crucial need for convalescent serum specimens, and we knew of very few survivors at that point, but that was one of the holy grails going out, was to find some survivors so that we can get some convalescent specimens. And finally, biocontainment for how would we manage these specimens. Now, this was the days of the VIP specimen transport, the vial in pocket. And we recognized even then that that was probably not the best approach to what may be potentially a dangerous infectious disease. So we wanted to make sure that the specimens were handled under P3 or higher. The organization that developed as the day went on was a field team, EIS officer Dr. Jeff Dushin, also EIS officer Ron Mollenauer, and myself would go out. I actually had a ticket that returned me to Atlanta the next Wednesday. Good thing that was a reimbursable fare. Because we're going into the 3-day weekend, exchanged a lot of home phone numbers. Rob Bryman, Louisa Chapman were 2 representatives of the Division of Bacterial Diseases and the Division of Viral Diseases. We also had as our lead in New Mexico, the state epidemiologist, Dr. Max Sewell at Indian Health Service, Jim Cheek. And it's interesting to look back, and we've actually been talking about this, that there's a lot of people say, oh, I knew it was a hantavirus all along. I certainly didn't, but I did find, and this is actually something I didn't notice in my notes until a couple years later, that there was a meeting in Mitch Cohen's office up on the 4th floor, as I recall, of Building 1. I have a brick from Building 1 that's next to that box in my barn, by the way. I didn't buy it. There was no barbed wire on the fence. I didn't know he was going to sell them, so I probably owe the EIS Alumni Society some money. I digress. C.J. Peters was in this meeting, and I have that he stated during that meeting that the pattern of cases runs parallel to rodent-borne Hantavirus. And I have to confess that I didn't think about hantaviruses for another week after that. And years later, I asked C.J. about it, and he just kind of shrugged, but that was C.J. Peters. He was quite a remarkable fellow and still is. So our plan was to come into the state very quietly, support behind the scenes. This is the point in the audio where we insert the sound of the phonograph needle scratching across the record. Next day, there was banner headlines about our arrival. The 2 other things on this front page of the paper, which I think are noteworthy. One is we arrived to find that people were very on edge. The night before we arrived, there had been a dance outside of Gallup A young woman had actually collapsed on the dance floor, been taken to Gallup Indian Medical Center. Resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. The clinicians involved describing suctioning up all kinds of frothy pink fluid. She seemed to be in pulmonary edema, but they could not resuscitate this otherwise young and previously healthy woman. We arrived late morning on Saturday, the 29th of May, and went right into a meeting at the University of New Mexico. And actually, press was allowed to come in and snap a picture of it, which you see here. That meeting went for, as I recall, 5 hours, and we discussed a wide variety of issues. One started with just the clinical picture, and it seemed to reinforce what we had originally heard, that there was a prodrome of a flu-like illness with myalgia, headache, and fever, followed by a rapid progression to respiratory distress. Now, at this point in time, we didn't know of many survivors, but a comment was made that people who survived seemed to recover fairly quickly also, which may very well tell us a little bit that we didn't know at the time. The ARDS picture, this was back when there was sort of the routine admission, Swan-Ganz catheter placement. Everybody had normal pulmonary artery wedge pressures, suggesting that it wasn't an issue with heart failure, but rather capillary leak, primarily involving the lungs. The LDH levels were often very high, again suggesting some bad juju going on in the lungs. That's a medical term for those of you who aren't in medicine. And the complete blood count showed usually a high blood count, sometimes a profound leukocytosis with a huge left shift, and there was also moderate thrombocytopenia. The earliest cases had been treated according to the routine for community-acquired pneumonia with a third-generation cephalosporin and intravenous erythromycin, apparently with no response. At the intensive care unit at the university hospital, they had started adding doxycycline and amantadine as well. Again, no, at least anecdotal responses. There had been extensive diagnostic testing done routinely, but those results were not indicating any particular etiology. A case definition for the descriptive epidemiology and hypothesis generation was developed, and that was a very simple, a severe case of pulmonary illness characterized, consistent with ARDS, occurring in a resident of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, or Colorado since January 1st of 1993. In looking at people who met that definition, it was observed that the case list at that time, which was about 12 to 15 people, tended to involve people who are young and oftentimes very athletic. It also was noted that the weather had been cooler and wetter than normal during that spring, although there's nothing in my notes to suggest that we had any conversation about rodents at that time. There were a number of concerns. Kurt Nolte and Edith Ullman from the medical examiner's office were there, and they shared some of their observations at the autopsies, but also shared that one of the autopsy techs who had assisted in 2 of the autopsies was ill with pharyngitis and gastrointestinal symptoms. Didn't sound like the same thing, but it really raised concerns about biocontainment, even surrounding performance of the autopsies. Infection control was a big issue. The intensive care unit at the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque had closed to new admissions. They were instituting respiratory precautions. There was very intense media attention, and that continued to ramp up. And because of the media attention, we actually had discussion about what to call the illness, because it's a little hard to go into a press conference and talk about the disease manifest as ARDS of unknown etiology. And indeed, the media would quickly fill that niche if we didn't come up with something. So across the top there, you see the most common name, the mystery illness. On Tuesday of the following week, I actually joined the team making clinical rounds in the intensive care unit at the UNM hospital. And the residents would talk about the patients with TMI, this mystery illness. Mystery flu was a term that was used. I think the most unfortunate was, as you see here in USA Today, Navajo flu. Not only was that stigmatizing, it wasn't even epidemiologically correct, because we certainly had people who were not Navajo, did not live on the reservation, who were showing up on our line list at this point. Because of the geographic location, Four Corners illness was also used. Over here on the far right of the slide, you see a reference to the Four Corners virus, and I'm going to leave it to Dr. Kizak to talk about the actual naming of the virus. But once the Hantavirus etiology was known, the name Hantavirus acute respiratory distress syndrome was floated, which quickly became HARDS, and I'm glad that that was abandoned. So regarding infection control, there really was a great deal of concern in the intensive care unit at the University Hospital, of course, a state-of-the-art facility that can institute a lot of aggressive respiratory precautions. Out in the clinics, it was a little tougher because any of you who've been primary care physicians know what a struggle it is when a child comes in with chickenpox or measles or some other airborne illness. This was a sign that I saw at one of the clinics and snapped a picture of, instructing people to stay in their car and let them know if you were present, and someone would come out and see you in your car. Maybe that was the first drive-through healthcare. So on Sunday, May 30th, again, we were struggling to have our quiet behind-the-scenes work. My phone in the hotel, this was before cell phones, really. I think we had some of the earliest cell phones. I remember seeing people holding bricks against the side of their head, wondering what that was about. But it was Max Sewell, the state epidemiologist, saying, I need you in Santa Fe in 2 hours. We're having a press conference. And I said, well, CDC doesn't usually participate in the state press conferences. And he said, well, we're having the press conference to say you're here, and we can't have the cameras panned to an empty chair. Can you please be here? So met briefly with Jeff and Ron. They were going over to the hospital. I went up to Santa Fe and did the press conference. It was an interesting discussion overall. There was, I think, an anticipation that we would have an answer already, and if not, by tomorrow. But at this point, the media coverage was pretty accurate in terms of presenting the data and saying, this is an unusual cluster. I didn't use the word epidemic, but it's used there, but nothing fits. And Dr. Ron Voorhees was the deputy state epidemiologist and had looked at the fact that there were things like healthcare providers were not apparently being impacted, and had tried to provide at least some reassurance that it doesn't appear to be a highly contagious disease. For myself, I had a chance to talk about some of the history of outbreaks of unknown etiology, but what really sobered me the most was referring to the Legionnaire's disease epidemic and saying that was 6 months later before the etiology was identified. And there was a moment of silence, and I heard one of the reporters say under their breath, I didn't know that. And I hope that, and I thought that's that point, we were there, but we didn't want to be there because this was going to be a long go if we didn't have an etiology discovered fairly quickly. And indeed, the media was both a friend and a foe in terms of getting information out. I think this epidemic may have been the first where the media preceded us, kind of like toxic shock syndrome and Legionnaire's disease were the first media outbreaks. This was one that not only was covered by the news media, but more like the Gulf War, the media was there first. And so even as we first began to approach people, we sometimes met signs like this. After the Hantavirus etiology was identified, there was still a lot of frustration with the media as reflected by this political cartoon in the Navajo Times. And indeed, there were a number of surreal moments, such as a couple weeks later when the tabloids ran this file. Jamie Childs, who you'll hear from in a bit, and I met with some Navajo Nation leaders. And one gentleman actually pulled this out and walked through with us all the real tragedies of how the federal government has treated Native American people over the centuries, and said, why should we not think you've brought this to us as well? And we knew in our heart of hearts that this was not so much an accusation as a political statement, but I was young and couldn't resist responding that, I hope you read the article because they quote someone named Norm Covert, which I assumed was some Dickensian fiction. What a great name for someone who is quoted in an article on the CIA. But I was still young, I was learning, and I think when I die, maybe my tombstone should read, Norm Covert lives. He is a real person. He's actually published a book on the history of Fort Detrick. So Norm Covert, if you're out there listening somewhere, I'm sorry that I denied your existence. And of course, there's politics involved as well. Surreal moment number 2 was when we got a message from the White House saying that the First Lady had been on the reservation just a couple of weeks before we arrived, and did we think there was any health risk for her? And of course, at this time, we did not know what the disease was. We didn't know what the incubation period was. And we said, no, no concerns at all. No, we shared that the investigation was ongoing and we didn't really have any specific advice to provide. This also led to another press event, which was, I'll say it was a bit distracting, but it was also another learning experience. The phone rings and it was Bob Howard at CDC. And he said, there's going to be a press event tomorrow in Window Rock, Arizona, hosted by Peter Sanzaw, the president of the Navajo Nation, and Senator Peter Domenici. And they want the senior people from CDC and Indian Health Service there. And I said, good, who are we sending? And the answer was, there'll be a plane at the airport tomorrow morning to take you to Window Rock. So that was my first experience with that kind of press event. Ben Muneta was with me from Indian Health Service. They actually introduced him as the director of the Indian Health Service. So Ben was an old friend from my EIS class, and I said, congratulations on your field promotion. They had a question for me, though, about what was going on in the labs at CDC, and I think Senator Domenici sort of spotted the vacant look on my face, and I started stumbling through some generalities about polymerase chain reaction. And he jumped in and told me he had just gotten off the phone with the director of the CDC and gave me what I would call a field briefing that gave me enough information that I was then able to talk about some of the work that was going on and the triage of specimens, and that we're casting a broad net for infectious diseases and considering toxins as well. And I'm grateful to Senator Domenici ever since. So the media did also do some other things that I think were not as helpful. One of the network medical reporters, this was Timothy Johnson, actually went on and advised people to avoid travel to the Southwest. I actually took a picture of what I scribbled in the margin of my notebook here. Too late for us, Tim. But this was concerning, and there are a number of aspects of this outbreak, as Dr. Kabaz mentioned, that were somewhat prescient of what was going to be happening in public health over the next quarter century. No one used the term social determinants of health at the time, but the impact on the local economy was really quite huge, and this is an area where the local economy is not very robust, depends on tourism, depends on the sale of the hand-woven rugs. And as you can see from some of the headlines, rug sales were down. It literally was months before the tourist industry could recover from the hit that they took. But then on June 3rd, in my memory and in my notes, the first breakthrough was, and this is represented by a fax here from Pierre Rollin to Tom Kizak in the Viral Special Pathogens Lab. And briefly, what it represents is evidence of cross-reactivity of a Hantavirus, looking at some of the specimens from the patients. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Hantavirus is not something we had been talking about the entire week, but this was a glimmer of hope, although it was one that we really wanted confirmation on, because we're now talking about a virus that had not been identified in a pathogenic form in humans in the New World before. It was also manifesting as a respiratory pathogen, even though we mostly know of it as a renal pathogen. And this really helped bring focus to the investigation, and started then a whole chain of events that Dr. Kizak will tell you more about, that including developing a PCR by Dr. Stuart Nickel, work by Sharif Zaki, who's also here with us today, and developing an immunohistochemical stain, and really allowed us to know what we were dealing with much more quickly. So with that focus, we could then move into a multi-pronged investigation, including a clinical description of what would later become known as Hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, led by Dr. Jeff Dushin. Looking at predictive clinical findings for HPS, because they weren't very specific, and we knew flu season was coming as well. And I believe Dr. Chuck Vitek took the lead on that. There was an open-label trial of intravenous ribavirin led by Dr. Louisa Castrodale. There was the rodent trapping and testing led by Dr. Jamie Childs, and he'll give you a whole world view of that. And then case control study of risk factors led by Dr. Paul Zeitz. Also at this time, Rob Bryman came out, the cavalry to the rescue, with a whole slew of EIS officers, which really helped us organize some of the epidemiological investigations. So on the evening of June 4th, the State Health Department called a press conference to announce the findings of evidence of hantavirus as an etiology. I realized that from Albuquerque or Santa Fe, we were too far away. So I drove to Gallup that evening to sort of set up what later would be the field station. Checking into a hotel just off of I-40 was a bit of a surreal experience, because the cast and crew from Natural Born Killers was staying there. So I remember one morning leaving the hotel just as they were coming in, and that was one of those things where I'm pinching myself. Am I still asleep and dreaming this? This is weird. Set up shop. I realized early on it wasn't going to be a matter of working out of the hotel room. I needed a fax machine. Went over to the hospital, made friends with the charge nurse on the OB floor, and was able to work from the doctor's work area over the weekend, and faxed some draft case control study questionnaires back and forth. The most important call I got that weekend was from somebody at CDC that recognized this guy's going down for the third time. Let's send him some more help. Pat McConnon came out. I didn't even know what a public health advisor was at that time, but Pat really saved our bacon in terms of coming in, recognizing the logistical needs we had, and making it happen. And that really was important. I mean, for one thing, just transport around the area. He got us a GSA van. I dropped the exhaust system on a cattle grate, but fortunately that was when Pierre Roland was out, and not only is he a world-class virologist, he also can put a muffler back using just a coat hanger. The trapping teams were going to be arriving very soon as well. These were pretty harsh conditions. It could be really hot out there. Pat made sure that we had some portable shade as well as water. He even had a Coke machine for us, which somehow that seems kind of antithetical to public health, but those Cokes really tasted good on a hot day. I should say sodas. That's not a commercial endorsement. And of course, the PPE was important as well. There's a picture of Louisa Castrodale, who helped one day with some of the trapping, getting the PPE in. I know whites faded to yellows over the 2-month period because we bought all of the bleach that was available in all of the stores in southwestern United States. And we had a space then to be able to manage questionnaires, data management. We had then PCs available. And you can see some of the questionnaires here. The case control study was very ambitious, led by Paul Zeitz over there on the right, and we had a number of personnel Joining us from the IHS area office, Rick Haskins, John Sorosky, Pat Bohan, and also Sue Reef had joined us from Atlanta and was really integral in doing some of the behind-the-scenes work in data management. It also gave us a place to be able to meet and to have offices for people from other agencies, such as the area office, the Navajo Nation Health Department. And it literally was such a team. We had a visiting state legislator, and I'm walking them around, and I realized, introduced them to somebody, I didn't know who they worked for. So we really were a tight and seamless team. We also had an opportunity then to work with the Johns Hopkins Center for Alaska Native and American Indian Health Studies. Matthew Santosham in Baltimore and Ray Reed, who is in the Southwest, was able to provide a half-day cultural orientation to us, which was really important. At one point, it wasn't clear if we were going to be able to do the investigation on the Navajo reservation. We were planning to go ahead off the reservation if necessary, but very fortunately, President Zaw agreed to let us come in and actually said, well, I have the Navajo Nation police. If the media bothers you, I'll call out the police. So he was actually very helpful. And I know Jamie and I had a very productive meeting with him, and I think he called Jamie his high-priced mouse catcher. And so Jamie was really integral in opening those doors. So there were issues to address that were challenges. Racism was a huge one, and of course our own cultural incompetence was a challenge, particularly we needed a crash course in how to approach someone who is grieving. As I mentioned, that's true universally, but is even more complicated in Navajo culture if that's not a culture that you've come from. I think it was very clear that there were issues surrounding racism. Some of it was borderline humorous in terms of you'd see people with out-of-state plates driving through with respiratory masks on. Others were really heartbreaking, such as the high school group that was to visit an amusement park and were instructed they weren't to come. I don't recall anything like that happening with a group of white kids coming from Lyme, Connecticut in the 70s. So there clearly was a stigma attached to this disease. In that was something that, again, a social determinant of health that we didn't use that phrase at the time, but was very important. But it did create opportunities for health communication. One thing CDC could say is this is not a Navajo disease. This is a disease that affects everyone who is exposed. It also provided a chance for us to begin getting out what we thought were some of the prevention messages, because cases were continuing to occur even as we were identifying the etiology and beginning to develop a suspect list of carriers, including then some very focused health education materials, brochures. This is actually a trifold brochure, some briefer posters that were available by late June and early July. And then, of course, getting the message out to healthcare providers, just a couple of the MMWRs that came out in the first couple of weeks after the investigation started. So in closing, Rima touched on a number of these issues, but I think this outbreak and the response really did change the conversation around public health in a number of areas, including emerging infectious diseases. The first IOM report had just come out a year earlier, and this outbreak highlighted the importance that this was not just a theoretical threat, but a real-world threat. No one was using the term One Health at the time, as Dr. Kabaz was mentioning earlier, but it began to expand the conversation beyond just domestic animals and agriculture, but also to look at wildlife, and also started more of the conversation about the role of climate. And then finally, the important role of tribes and tribal health agencies in public health. And we look at how much has changed in 25 years. Now CDC has a Center for State Tribal Local and Territorial Support. We now have the Cherokee Nation is an accredited public health agency, and 5 more tribal health agencies are now in the process of achieving accreditation. So the conversation has changed around tribal entities, and increasingly public health is recognized as a function of tribes in their role as sovereign nations. Also pertinent to 2018, the role of the astute clinician, the importance of building state, tribal, and local health department infrastructure in preparedness and response. And especially coming from a state, I want to emphasize the role of CDC as a global resource for global health security. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Tom Kizak. I get to play the opening gig for the real rock stars. So, Tom, there was a lot going on in the lab that Senator Domenici gave me only 5 seconds of. So come tell us what was going on back at the ranch.
Well, it's fun to be here, and I hope to do this, give it proper credit anyway. I was there anyway. Special pathogens had been sort of reconstituted. I was in the Army at Fort Detrick, and probably the event that led for a big changeover happened to be the Reston Ebola outbreak, and I came with Dr. C.J. Peters immediately following that, having participated and worked on Ebola as well as other diseases important to the military. You see a list of them there, but hantavirus was one of them. A drug trial was being conducted in China on Korean hemorrhagic fever with ribavirin, which plays out in this story as well. And I had been involved in developing diagnostic tests. And Dr. Pierre Roland, who you see pictured here, actually is part of the Reston outbreak, putting on a sort of field-adaptable spacesuit, was also part of that response. And Stuart Nickel, who plays also a very prominent role in this, had come from the University of Nevada at Reno in '92. I was actually the first of the guys pictured here to arrive in August of '91. So this has already been recounted. The first I remember hearing about this is there's an award given in DVRD, or what was DVRD, called the Pekka Hallinen Award, and I had developed some Lassa diagnostics, and I had given a presentation, I think, on the Friday before the holiday. And the first I remember hearing about it was Brian Mahi approaching me at the tavern up the road here, PJ's, and dropping a dime on myself and Pierre about this sort of happening. And then this first week of June, which would have followed, involved materials finally arriving from New Mexico and their distribution. We didn't test just for hantaviruses. This was a very broad-based approach, and we test for a number of the hemorrhagic fevers that we were responsible for. Several hantaviruses in tests developed at Fort Detrick that were among those that were applied. And as Jay already pointed out, there was a lot of excitement, at least in the New Mexico area, which was beginning to carry over to us here in Atlanta, who were involved in this as well. So diagnostics of hantaviruses in general, prior to the discovery of this agent in the New World and here in the Americas, was really based on serology. It was, first of all, based on an indirect fluorescent antibody assay, which is detecting antibody that develops. With hantaviruses, actually, they have a fairly long incubation period, and the antibody is a fairly early thing that develops, so it's not like it's altogether useless for acute diagnosis, but the indirect fluorescent antibody assay is pretty subjective, and I think it's often overinterpreted. So part of what I did at Detrick was to help to develop newer generation assays for detecting IgM and IgG using ELISA tests. And because we were involved in not only in Korea and China, but also in Europe, we developed a couple of other assays, some of which we applied. So this was, if you read the last sentence in the abstract here, we went back in a collection of materials from the Korean hemorrhagic fever cases that occurred during the Korean War. A guy named Joe Smedell, who's sort of a legendary figure in infectious diseases, had collected and put away lyophilized materials from patients, and we went back through this collection and were able to show that this IgM assay in particular was a very good means of doing acute diagnosis. It says here the method of choice, I think. And so, again, that's what we ended up applying as well as these other viruses, other tests rather for other viruses. We went backwards there somehow. And Jay already showed this slide, but essentially the week after we found out about this, the materials were set up, and we set up virus isolation attempts as well as a variety of ELISAs. And then I went off to Fort Detrick because there was a meeting with some Russians about hantaviruses, and we had sort of set these up, and then I went off, and then Pierre sent this fax up to Fort Detrick, which, as Jay indicated, using not the viruses that occur here, but these other viruses that we had worked in other regional parts of the world, showed some cross-reactivity. So this was really the first evidence that pointed us in the direction of hantaviruses, and it did set off a cascade of use. I mean, one of the first things I can remember quite clearly was a discussion with CJ about getting some of our colleagues who could collect rodents out to the field where some of those could be sent back, and that then becomes a further part of the cascade, as we'll see later, and Jamie's going to talk about. So, you know, this really wasn't, the hantaviruses that we knew about really were not known to be communicable in the true sense of the word, that is patient-to-patient transmission, did not appear part of their standard epidemiology. And so that remained true, I would say, throughout this outbreak. And sort of the normal model of natural history of these is that rodents become chronically infected. They probably are sort of front-loaded in shedding, but they maintain the virus as well as transmit it to among their species, but also to other species, humans, and some other rodents that occur in their natural setting. And so it's thought that a lot of the transmission is by aerosol, secreta and excreta that becomes airborne, either primarily or after it dries into dust, being sort of the primary source. And these were the sort of principal hantaviruses that were known about. Hantan and Sol are what are known as Old World hantaviruses. Both of them are probably originating in Asia. Sol virus, because it's associated with paradomestic rats, rodents, was here in the Americas, and Dr. Jim Leduc, who was at WHO at the time, had, along with Jamie, shown that the virus is present in most port cities and large cities in the U.S. So we did have the virus, but the disease associated with that virus is really unlike what was seen here. And Prospect Hill is found in a vole that occurs in the U.S., but had not been associated with any human disease. And Pumala is an old world virus occurring in Europe primarily. And then this is sort of the distribution of Hantan and Sol primarily. And this is Pumala and Dobrava, relatively at this time new viruses that's closely related to Hantan, but occurs in a different region. So the viruses don't grow like standard viruses that we work with normally, like Rift Valley fever or Ebola virus. It's very hard to isolate them. Almost all of the isolates of the virus didn't come from human cases, but rather from rodents. It's somewhat easier to get them out of the rodents. They seem to have more of the virus present. And RT-PCR, which ended up being probably a very important and milestone event in this outbreak, was in its very early infancy at the time. So this, again, became a big deal, and there was a paper published in Science. I think you have a picture of the lead page from that later on, but when it was published, there were sort of editorials about what a remarkable event, identifying this and using the sequences that come from the PCR in a very useful way. And so, again, this was one of the earmarks of this outbreak that made it a landmark. Here's a very brief description of RT-PCR. this is essentially a nested PCR. So the sensitivity is somewhat dependent on the amount of RNA for the virus that's present. The RT stands for reverse transcriptase. Since this is not DNA, and PCR really depends on amplification of DNA, you have to convert the RNA to DNA. And then there's a double swipe at amplification using nested primer sets that make this a very sensitive assay. That's a good thing, but it can also, in some instances, be unfortunately a bad thing because it's easy to get cross-contamination in these assays, and they're not particularly in this outbreak, but in other outbreaks, there are horror stories about false positives that can arise from the sensitivity and cross-contamination that can occur. But this, again, ended up being a very landmark. So here you see a couple of patients, I believe, in their tissues with that bright dotted line down at the end being the amplimers. Shown in a gel, which was at the time of this assay the way that we developed the assay. So this is DNA of a particular size that's expected from the amplification process and indicates that those tissues contained the RNA of the virus and that there was hantavirus present in the tissues. And then taking those fragments and sequencing them, one can put together using the genetic code a phylogram of what the viruses are and how they're related to other known hantaviruses. And you can see with one of the names that this virus that didn't stick was new, probably most close related to Prospect Hill, another virus that occurred here in the New World, and the Pumala branch, with the other Old World hantaviruses being more distantly related. And this also, in the way that nowadays is commonly practiced, allowed some epidemiology to occur. So if you have a sequence and there's some variation in the populations, you can view these differences of the variation and make statements about the virus. So one of the strategies that Jamie will talk about, I'm sure, is that case premises had rodents trapped, and we had in a number of instances, the sequence of the human case that occurred on the same premises, and we could show identity in a number of these rodents. And in more distant cases in the region, you might find that the virus was closely related, but often not so much a direct match or a very specific match like it often was. And Jamie will tell you, I guess, about cases from other regions that popped up in these exercises. So this was, again, published in Science. I mentioned this earlier. Again, this is kind of a landmark paper in emerging infections, and certainly didn't hurt the reputation of CDC nor the group that did the lab work. I don't want to let this pass without also mentioning one of the partners that we often work with in these emerging infections, and that's the infectious disease pathology group. And there were instances where no serum or blood was available, and only tissues that had been collected and fixed were available. And Dr. Zaki's group went to some lengths to develop immunohistochemical assays that could identify the presence of antigens in the tissues of these patients, and not only in the outbreak itself, but also looking back retrospectively. So I think there were cases as far back as the 50s where individuals had noted that they had described or prosected cases that had clinical outcomes that matched this disease, and some of those tissues were presented, and I think there's at least one or two papers describing that. So this is sort of a retrospective, not specifically a case, but here in the figure to the left, as you look at it, you can see the presence of antigen, which are the red dots you see in the capillaries that line the alveoli of the lung that's here. And so this became another means of demonstrating in a direct way some of the pathogenesis, and gave us some clues about what the pathogenesis was. There's very little inflammation in the lung, and so it was sort of derived that a lot of this is sort of a misdirected cytokine and other immunologic factors that precipitate the capillary leak that leads to the pulmonary edema. So again, this is a more specific timeline. So the preliminary laboratory tests you saw on that fax were the fourth, and in spite of not really having much confirmation, that immediately led to this open label ribavirin trial that was instituted, that the PCR was rapidly put together once we had an etiology, because you have to have some knowledge of what you're trying to amplify in order to make a PCR assay run. The rodent guys, I think, were dispatched very quickly, and then the first sequence was less than a week later, so that's pretty rapid by anybody's assessment. And I think the first rodents after the team got there were trapped on the 9th, and those were rapidly dispatched back to Atlanta. And about the 40 rodents that were trapped at one case residence, 30% of them were positive. I think they were all maniculatus, although I may be mistaken about that. So we sort of, at least part of the circle became closed, and if you look further down, the rodent tissue sequences were then rapidly developed, and you could match them up with the cases from the same premises. So again, sort of that really closed the circle on this. That leads to, again, that I brought up that it's hard to isolate these viruses, but we nevertheless persisted. But if you look at the data at the bottom of the slide, it took a while. And what it took eventually was we took a rodent that was in the very acute phases of infection, and we took it into the BSL-4, and we actually inoculated other Paramyscus maniculatus that were available from a commercial source with those tissues, and we were able to isolate thusly the virus, which then led to another issue. What are you going to call this? And in the grouping of viruses that I traditionally have worked with, it's usually named after a place associated with where the virus isolate was made, except that ended up being a political hot potato. So you can see here a number of possibilities, all of which were struck. And here's where my presentation and Dr. Nichols probably end up bifurcating. He has the source of the name being someplace in California. And I don't remember anybody looking at maps of California for naming the Four Corners area virus. But he could be right. But I do remember looking at maps, and we did come across Sin Nombre. You can, if you just do a Google on Sin Nombre in New Mexico, there's a lot of streets with that name. There's a ski area and a mountain named Sin Nombre. There's a region that's called Sin Nombre, and that's my remembrance, is that it's not really a specific place, and it's probably not one where we really got the rodents from which the isolate was made, but rather we've been shot down a number of times, and this was, in my view, a pretty good tongue-in-cheek approach to giving a name to this thing. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So then lab work went on after this. So we developed specific serologic assays. Heinz Feldman, who was a senior NRC fellow, he's now the head of the BSL-4 NIH lab in Hamilton, Montana, cloned the nucleocapsid antigen and expressed it, and we began to use that in the IgG assay, and we, with the isolate, were able to grow up antigens that were used in an IgM capture assay, which we distributed to the state health departments here in the U.S., and we had a couple of sessions where we brought laboratorians in and trained them, and we also had friends in virus laboratories where hemorrhagic fevers were interested, and we shifted the technology to them, and that, in a later slide I'll show you, became the source of interest and a lot of hantaviruses that were described and a lot of diseases that in fact were described in those regions. But it continued to occur here in the U.S., and this is the most recent slide I could come up with on short notice after, I should have said that Dr. Nickel bailed to go to the Ebola outbreak or to Geneva to manage the Ebola outbreak, and I got called in to this Sunday before last, and so then I do appreciate the folks in Special Pathogens coming up with the figure, but you can see that the outbreak year was 93, and it's still the highest number. Jamie will probably describe more about why that might be, why it goes up and down, et cetera. But it still does occur, and it goes up and down, as you see. And it's, not altogether associated with the southwest U.S., but if you look at the numbers on the maps, it still remains sort of the areas of highest incidence. And finally, that point I made about the viruses associated with New World hantaviruses not being limited to the U.S. The viruses that have a red name are associated with human diseases. And in some of the tropical areas, the case counts are much higher than they are here in North America, largely because the number of rodents and the density of rodents in tropical and subtropical areas, and also sort of probably the nature of the populations and their association with the land are also tighter, and therefore the number of cases associated with these viruses and their rodents can be and often is somewhat higher. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Childs, who carried out the rodent arm of the investigations in the Four Corner area and a lot of the subsequent work that was done.
Let me just say that it's great to be back in CDC and see some old friends, literally. And I want to thank especially Phoebe Thorpe for putting this together and keeping us on track, and she did a terrific job. Thank you. So, of mice and men, or of men and mice? This was one of the rags which I love this cover. And just in case you're blind like me, you can see that this is our CDC representative out there in the Four Corners. Suspicions were rampant, as they always will be when you're investigating deadly outbreaks. And it's the nature of the game. I want to take you back to 1993, because during that year and years previous, there was a fairly intensive operation out of Johns Hopkins, which I was a part of, looking for cases of hemorrhagic fever renal syndrome among Baltimore residents. We were studying rats and also did some detailed epidemiological studies. And the prevalence of sole virus infection, as Tom mentioned, this is an old world virus, which presumably came over when Rattus norvegicus was introduced in the United States, probably in the 1970s or perhaps earlier. And we were involved in not only looking at the virus and isolating viruses from rats in Baltimore, but also following up what might be the clinical disease. But first, a tour of Baltimore. Now, those of you who have been to Johns Hopkins, this is about 2 blocks away from the medical school and School of Public Health. And let's see, just to show you the remarkable situation, well, you can see the black arrows, and they are highlighting rodent burrows in these poor neighborhoods around Baltimore. And you can actually note the extensive amount of dirt which these rats have extracted, and often these cement backyards are cracking because they're hollow underneath. So finding rats wasn't difficult, and Phoebe actually blew up this image of me, but it's mislabeled. It should say, "There was hair." And in any case, shows me outside of a refuse heap in an alley in Baltimore. And if you see that sign posted on the telephone pole, it says that this block was just treated for rat control. Our traps were full every night. Rodent control is extremely difficult, and there's never been a successful eradication program for Rattus norvegicus in any city environment. Still isn't. So just to give you an idea of what we were finding, and what I have up at the top is the seroprevalence and titers for another rodent-borne virus, this one an arenavirus, lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus, which we were also studying, which Tom was involved with these studies. And you can see on the left, hantavirus antibodies, anti-SOL, were very rare. And we looked at a huge number of individuals who came to an STD clinic. This was 1993, and we didn't know anything about HIV. But we were there, hepatitis C, collecting these, and they turned out to be valuable samples. Very few Hantan positive. But we went on to look at dialysis patients who had end-stage renal disease, and also patients which had proteinuria with or without renal disease. And in a series of studies, we came up with very high odds ratios where SOL virus antibody prevalence was higher in these groups, not the background prevalence I showed you in the last slide, which showed that a consistent association with chronic renal disease, hypertensive renal disease, and these associations wouldn't go away no matter what how we treated the data. So in 1993, we did have evidence of hantavirus infection in Old World rodent with an Old World virus. The only endemic virus in the United States was Prospect Hill, as Tom mentioned, and this virus was not known to cause any disease, and to date, it's not known to cause any disease. So we were focusing on rats, and at the time, CDC became very interested in these studies, and we were gearing up for larger studies looking at this association, but 1993 happened in Four Corners, and these aspirations were laid to rest. So the Four Corners. Now, I'm not sure, I think probably many of you have been on outbreaks. And you'd think the first thing you would do with an outbreak like this is rush to the field, which we did. But the problem was CDC per diems were so low that we couldn't afford staying in the days inn. And there was tremendous discontent. Here we were with an unknown virus doing odd things. So Pat McConnell stepped in once again. He found us housing in the El Rancho Hotel, where rooms were named after various people. Jay stayed in the Ira Lupino room.
It was the Ronald Reagan suite.
Oh, yeah. I stayed in John Wayne's suite, of course. Anyway, after solving that problem, we had extensive meetings with representatives, including President Zaw of the Navajo Nation, and once he gave us support, he gave us full support, and a number of individuals who were members of the Navajo Nation joined our team, which was essential. Trying to find your way out there is a challenge, and dealing with the suspicion and uncertainty surrounding the situation, Navajo representatives were critical to getting us into the tribal areas. And this is our group, and I'll make a comment at the end. Close camaraderie develops between these people, and you see John Krebs with the fingers above his head, with Leonard Freeland, who's a Navajo who's assigned to us, Sue Harvey, Herman Shorty, who was critical to our investigations, Navajo of great humor, very traditional, followed the ancient traditions of the Navajo, including hanging himself from his cords inserted through his breast tissue. Ken Gage from Fort Collins, and Rusty Enscore, who you can see at the end, and Gary Maupin in the back. So this was a joint effort among CDC, Atlanta, Fort Collins, the Indian Health Service, and the Navajo Nation. And everyone played a part, and it was a great team. Privileged to be part of it. So, as I'll show, we usually left the hotel around 4 a.m. after a few aspirin. And then we would get to our trapping sites and collect our rodents. And then we would set up our processing center. And in the background is a hogan, where an individual had died, and we would venture into the Hogan, at least those who were willing to shave off their beards, and you'll see we had these full-face respirators, which are extremely uncomfortable, and it was only later in the investigation that we received our PAPRs, which are powered air purifying respirators, which are far more comfortable and blow some reasonably cold air over your face. This is miserable, actually, and sure makes me hungry and thirsty. And this is not only the after we trapped, but this is the before. And it shows you what people, mammalogists and ecologists, how they took precautions against hantavirus infection before this investigation started. And I've circled some key features. A bunch of dead mice cut open. They had beer. Second circle. And you can see one of the mouse individuals. This is proper hygiene. This is proper sanitation when dealing with hantaviruses. Your comrade feeds you your sandwich. Anyway. And actually, our findings did have tremendous repercussions on ecology and mammalogy programs because they were used to doing this. And after we discovered these viruses, they had the dressing gown and they hated us. Anyway, just to give you an inkling of what a profile of hantavirus prevalence is shown in male and female deer mice. And this has now been a standard pattern, especially with the hantaviruses that we've studied in the New World, in which juvenile animals, those under 14 grams, are rarely infected, while those which are young adults become infected, and those which are adult mice are commonly infected, with the male always having a higher prevalence of antibodies than the female, which we ascribe to aggression, especially probably involved with mating. And one of the other things that we had discovered when we were working with rats is if you blow up the youngest age groups, which are shown in the insert, what you find is declining antibody prevalence. And this is, we ascribe to maternal antibody passage, which protects these very young mice from active infection. So what you see is this is a childhood disease, and mice, the prevalence can be very high. Rats in Baltimore, when you reached adult size, had prevalences in excess of 80% soil virus infections. Here you see in excess of 30-odd% for large sample size. Characteristic. So this was the first paper which came out identifying Paramyscus maniculatus as the reservoir host, and it was typical of the cohesion between the ecologists and the laboratory scientists, and also the people involved in the environmental work out in the four corners. It was a very exciting moment, and this paper, of course, was a complement to that, showing that humans were infected with hantaviruses and their neighborhood rodents were similarly infected. The bad news. As Tom mentioned, Paramyscus maniculatus is probably the most widely distributed and populous of any rodents found in the United States. You can see its distribution occurs across the country, with the exception of some very eastern sites, and its kissing cousin on the right, Paramyscus leucopus, which is infamous as being the reservoir for Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease, also has an extensive distribution, but it's much more common in the eastern seaboard. But it does get up in the Midwest, where they also have foci of Lyme disease. And it also carries a hantavirus, New York 1. And there have been, I'm not sure how many cases, I know there's been one death reported of New York 1, but the major culprit of SNV and another virus, Monongahela, is the deer mouse. We conducted a household-based case control study where we were placing traps within the hogans in which people died, which is often a depressing situation. You go in these hogans and you find dirty dishes in the sink, unmade beds, and one there was a cradle, hasty removal of the individuals. That brought a lot of it home. But when we did these case control studies, we had a near and far control, and we not only compared lots of relevant details about food storage, etc., brush around the house, but the main thing which turned out, although it appears in the first bar, the rodent infestation was very high around the houses in which cases had occurred, but this includes a lot of small mammals, and we were finding antibody in a number of different Paramiscus species, and later on, more extensive studies back at CDC indicated that these were additionally novel hantaviruses, each primarily associated with a different species of Paramiscus or other rodent. The interesting thing was, although antibody prevalence was higher in the case households, it was not significantly different on statistical analysis, but this is a relatively small sample size. It's certainly suggestive. But what was significant is catching a large number of Paramiscus within and around the households. So we called it a number game. More rodents, high prevalence, and contact was more likely to occur. One of the last things we did, and again, proof I was actually there, was train, I think it was 7 groups of environmental specialists, many from vector control, because there wasn't much concern about rodents at this time, in how to safely conduct field studies on these potentially infected animals and what sort of equipment you had to have. And this was very labor intensive, and the state health departments appreciated it. Very hot work. Set up in the parking lot, which was made available to us. And finally, a couple of the related products, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about some interesting findings on why this outbreak may have occurred in 1993. We published very early on interim recommendations for risk reduction. Avoid mice, basically. Keep them out of your house. And what turned out to be a very popular publication at some length, published with Jim Mills, methods for trapping and sampling small mammals for virological testing. And this described the details of how you can safely do this, and long lists of materials you need, very detailed, and where to get them. Because this sort of effort requires tremendous planning, everything from buckets to and bleach to disinfect your traps, to all the labels and all the traps to catch these things. Very extensive planning goes into this sort of work. Now, why worry about this now? And what brought this about? Actually, that's not the title I wanted. In addition to CDC preparedness and the serendipity of having a migration from USAMRIID, which worked on these hantaviruses, which were a military problem, especially in Korea, Tom Kizak, C.J. Peters, and Jim LeDuc. And in 1992, I followed from Johns Hopkins. But Tom et al. Brought the reagents which allowed the lab to crack the case. And if they hadn't come, I'm not sure what sort of reagents CDC special pathogens had at that time to look at old world hantaviruses. Finally, why 1993? And this is a interesting slide. Bob Parmenter and Terry Yates had a long-term ecological site, not right at Gallup or in Navajo country, where they're following rodents long-term. And they had noticed Paramiscus maniculatus problem just shot up in 1993. Later on, there were all sorts of efforts made to link that with the original outbreak. But the most important link is what we came to call the trophic cascade, in which abiotic factors such as increased precipitation, lower temperatures, result in ecosystem productivity, positive, and earlier So in 1992, we had mild winters promoting rodent survivorship, and in early spring, lots of plant and food for these animals, and the population swelled. And you can see that feeds into increasing fecundity and decreasing mortality, which increases the reservoir population abundance, SNV transmission, and ultimately human encounters with mice. One of the nice things about having a trophic cascade is you can measure these environmental variables. And what has become common now, if we look at the top slide, and Greg Glass published a number of papers, including in PNAS, on this phenomenon, but this is a summary paper, quite long. What you can see in the images above, the green is good, and you can see that the variation over time in terms of dry and wet habitat varies. And when he matched cases, he did case control study where risk was under 10% in the low risk population, up to 25% in the medium risk population. And these were matched people who were infected with many controls, and then he could develop a predictive map based on the rainfall and temperature profiles. And it was a remarkable feat. If you look at the cumulative data over, this is from 92 to 96, the match between predicted and observed, predicted in light gray, observed in the black, was remarkable. And I'm not sure this has continued, but he's gone on to show a similar phenomenon in Argentina with Hantavirus, which causes very severe disease in that country. Just to give you a sense of the camaraderie that develops, I recommend this book, Alexandra Levitt's Deadly Outbreaks. And we were called cowboys by Pat McConnon. So cows in the whatever in John Wayne suite, so the shoe fits. And we worked long hours. We took a lot of precautions, and we often didn't get home till the bar at El Rancho was closing. And we told them who we are, and we asked if they would remain open a little later to serve the nation's interests. Anyway, I have slides of acknowledgments that Phoebe put together with the field team, laboratory team, and the epidemiology team. I'm not going to go through all these, but there are also other individuals at the medical centers at Gallup and Indian Health Service, and of course we couldn't have done this without the help of the Navajo Nation and all these groups on the right. And there's the last acknowledgments, and with that, I will take my seat. Thank you very much.
If we could bring the lights up, we have a few minutes for questions. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. So I have a question for Tom Kizak, Stephen Rowe from the laboratory. So you mentioned that PCR was a relatively new technique at the time, and did you recall encountering resistance to people believing the validity of the PCR test since it wasn't a very established diagnostic at that time?
There was some doubt about whether we were correct in ascribing etiology to the Hantavirus, which we thought was present, that maybe it was just there as a matter of chance. And, I think in the long run that sort of died out as cases continued to occur and the pathology, the PCR, and the serology all continued to match up. And we did do with NHANES sera, for instance, a look at prevalence, and this certainly wasn't a common infection, so I think that also would have helped people sort of understand that acute infections with this is not a good thing. So,
Yeah, and I think there was skepticism in the field, particularly when we started talking about specific rodents, because everyone recognized that, well, these rodents have been here forever. Why are we only recognizing it now? But that then also led to some look-back investigations, and fairly quickly, I think there were some specimens from the late 70s from a investigation in Montana that were identified as positive, and then as time has gone on, even earlier. But certainly there was that whole thing of, well, this is one test. When do we say anything about this? How much confirmation do we need? And I think that's always a challenge when you have a surprise finding, and really the wrong place, the wrong organ. It just didn't line up with what we would expect to see with the known hantaviruses.
And there were, at least we were informed that long-lived, well-respected Navajo leaders had recalled earlier outbreaks where there was a severe outbreak or severe cases of a pulmonary disease following very wet springs, but this, who knows?
one other comment I might make is that this outbreak occurred in '93. I was also involved in the SARS outbreak in 2003. And I hope there's nobody from FDA in the audience, but we didn't have a lot of insistence that this had to be an FDA-approved assay as we tried to roll it out to the state health departments, et cetera.
Yeah. Just great talk, guys. Just wanted to make a quick comment about seeing is believing. And on the same day of the PCR, we have the immunohistochemistry showing the virus in the lungs of these patients where we're dying. So same day of the PCR, actually showing it there, showing why these patients had a capillary leak syndrome.
And I have to add, this is Dr. Sharif Zaki, if people aren't aware, who developed the immunohistochemical stain, and being able to show that, as well as pictures of the gels that Dr. Kizak showed, were very helpful for people who were into the science and understood why some of us were even questioning, is this accurate or not? But as the investigation unfolded and we were able to show the rodent trapping data as well as the epidemiological data that linked exposure, particularly to areas like where I stored my Hanta box, and the risk of being exposed to aerosol dried rodent droppings, it really came together pretty nicely. We did hear one disturbing anecdote of a gentleman who developed the disease after cleaning out a shed and commented that I guess they were right. I don't know if that's true or not. I hope it's not. But I think as time has passed, more and more people believe that this is the etiology, which the science still firmly supports.
Hi, and I have a question from our online audience about whether there's a vaccine being developed for hantavirus.
I don't think that here at CDC there have been efforts, but people at USAMRIID have been interested in vaccines, including for SNV. I mean, I guess one of the issues is that the incidence was actually quite high in certain focused areas, but how would you deploy such a vaccine, and what's the economic argument for it? The military has a little bit different view where they're deploying folks into areas of, suspected to being of high risk, and so their model's a little bit different than a public health model.
Yeah.
Question in the back.
Hi, I'm Delight Satter with the office that Jay was referring to in C-STILTS, the Office for Tribal Affairs and Strategic Supports. So I wanted to kind of bring it back forward and back to Jay's comments about social determinants of health. When I first came to CDC in 2011, I worked with Navajo Nation and Pierre Rolin, Craig Manning, to help rebuild trust so that further work could continue at Navajo on hantavirus. And that continues to today, and we worked on a CDC Foundation application to work on health education and mouse exclusion. But I think it's very important in this audience to talk about our office being a resource so that work that you're doing now or starting now can set forward in a good way to avoid some of the things that did take place that often isn't even us, it's other actors, perhaps our colleagues in academia and other places, but we're here to help navigate that and support your work.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank the speakers for an outstanding presentation. Thank you. I'd also like to take a moment to ask anybody who was involved with the Hanta original investigation to stand and be recognized, if they're in the audience. And also, anybody who works in the Hantavirus now, please stand. And thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you in early November for the next We Were There.